Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on our live stream this week. My name is Dan. I am your once and forever host here at Cerbos. Today, we're going to be talking about open source. What is open source? Is it right for you? Is it right for your business? How do you get started? What's it contributing on IMD? All these questions and more are going to be answered today on stream, and I am pleased as punch to be joined by our surprise guest for today, Cobus from AWS. Cobus, please introduce yourself.
That is a very, very long question. You said we've got about 7, 8 hours, right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so in a nutshell, I think if I have to sum it up, is a combination of things. Firstly, it's as it suggests, open source means the source is open and available, so you need to be able to see the source, which is useful, but that's not the only part of it because there's lots of open source. Well, there's lots of source on the internet that you can look at, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can actually use it. And that's where I think the licensing component comes in, where you always have to look as well as what does the license itself say. And I mean, it goes, there's a whole spread of them in terms of what you can do with them. Some of them allow you to take the code, modify it, use it for commercial purposes without re-open sourcing it or sharing those changes. Others are very different in the sense that you have to share the code. You're not allowed to modify it, or you are allowed to modify it, but you have to share it, but you can't make money from it. So there's a whole long list of licenses out there that you have to take into account.
Right. Fair enough. And that's all 100% true and accurate. And I have nothing more to add to it, except that I asked you to introduce yourself, not
So
open source.
brain, brain fart. I need more, more coffee in the morning. So hi, I'm Cobus. I'm not open source. Um, sorry, I was actually opening up the live stream on the side just so I can see if there are any comments and things. Keep an eye on it. But yeah, so my name is Cobus. I am, as you can hear, not from this time zone originally, which is Seattle at the moment. I am from Cape Town. Background in software development, then went into the fun role of DevOps with the title as well as, the culture and all those fun things, automating a bunch of things. And then I joined AWS as a senior developer advocate based out of Cape Town in January 2019. I have to actually think now. It's almost 6 years. Covering Sub-Saharan Africa, and then almost 3 years ago moved to the US to join one of the teams here. So now I am a video developer advocate at the moment, is the current title I believe we use.
Video developer advocate. So you're advocating for the development of video?
Yes, video everything.
Very good. AWS, for those of you who maybe are not familiar with AWS as an organization, it is a fairly large tentacular organization. Provides a wide variety of services and offerings at many different levels, and there are many different types of roles inside of AWS. Cobus has had the pleasure of working at a few of them, actually. So maybe we can get a little bit of insight into a little bit about open source at AWS and what that looks like a little bit later on. For those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, don't know me, hi again, my name is Dan. I'm one of the computer people here at Cerbos. You probably can't hear it from my accent, but I am also not actually from this time zone. I am currently broadcasting from sunny, very sunny Phoenix, Arizona in the United States, not normally here. And really, it's a nice time zone to be hanging out with Cobus because normally we're too far apart, right? So we got some questions, and I'm going to kind of get to them in a little bit moment. But just remind everybody, if you want to ask questions, please go ahead and do that. That's what the Cerbos Slack is for. Join us on our Slack. You can talk in the community channel. That would be really, really great. We'd love to see you there. But I know that some of y'all are shy. Certainly from last week, we realized that it's okay to be shy, and if you just want to DM me your questions directly, that's totally okay. Don't worry about it. Some of you have my email address. If you want to email me questions, I'm not going to necessarily be looking at that during the stream, but hopefully I can get to that afterwards as well. So no problem. All right. So I actually just want to jump right in and get to one of the questions that I get the most, either on the community Slack or when I'm out, in the field, at conferences, at meetups, right? Just hanging out. And we already kind of talked about kind of what is open source, but the big question is, well, like, why open source, right? We get that the code is available. We understand that there's different types of licenses, and we get the arcana of licenses at another time. I don't know how specifically interesting that is, right? But maybe the bigger question there is like, why open source? Thoughts, Cobus?
Oh, that is a fun one. I mean, for me personally, it's probably just about, geeking out and being excited about something and then sharing it with people and then working with them and getting contributions from them. So it's a nice way to actually just collaborate out in the open and get other inputs. And if you want, potentially even people from the community helping you to build some features and things. Because I think one of the big benefits there is I've got an idea of to build something. I think I know exactly what the problem space is. So I go and build it, and then someone else comes along and says, "Hey, listen, have you thought about using it for that? Or what about we add this?" And so that kind of has like a snowball effect of getting more ideas into it and refining it and figuring out like what to do with it. And I enjoy it. It's a lot of fun.
That's absolutely true in my experience. But the question then there is, why can't you have that in a closed source environment, right? If you've got a whole bunch of developers working on a product, you got people, increasingly sitting around desks again, right, with their noise canceling headphones on,
Oh
but
yeah.
nonetheless sitting together. Why is that environment not necessarily going to generate the same ideas, the same features, the same outcomes as an open source project?
Well, I'd say it's fairly simple in the sense that you're limited to whoever's around you and whoever can see that code. So if it's inside an office, it's literally who's sitting next to you that can see it. Maybe it's inside an organization that is spread over the globe, and you've got an internal source repository that those folks can then look at. But I mean, that's a tiny fraction of the developer population. It's a small subset. And now you also need to hope there's someone else that's as interested in whatever you're building as you are, because it doesn't even necessarily mean there will be someone that A likes the thing you're trying to solve, B the tools or the language that you're using or anything like that. So it's you might still just be sitting there on your own.
Right. Well, the sitting there on your own is, a non-trivial problem, right? And that's going to be true if you're at a university. That's going to be true if you're in a professional work environment. It's going to be true in open source as well. And that actually leads a beautiful segue. It's like we've planned this.
Well, you may have, I didn't.
Yes. But it's a beautiful segue into like how do you get started, right? So let's see how you go. Okay, like I like this idea of open source. I like the idea of putting my code out there. I'd like to get other people involved. I'd like to get other people interested in the code base and the problem I'm trying to solve. Uh, how do I get other people on board? Or conversely, maybe we'll start even a little earlier than that. There is an open source project. I am interested in it. How do I get started? Let's start with that.
Ooh, okay. So starting with the second one, if there's a project you see, it's not just a case of let's jump in and send some code. Because let's say you see there's something, oh, I want to build something, or I just have an idea, let's add it. You go off, you fork the repo, you then add your code and you send them a pull request. They'll likely go, what's this about? Because a big part of open source is actually the conversation and the understanding what it is that you're trying to do. So most open source projects have some form of contribution guidelines or how to contribute with a list of things that they're looking for help for. Some of them will accept, I think, like random-ish things like here's an idea. But the base is let's first have the conversation about what it is I want to contribute, or you just go in and ask. I mean, normally, if you go to the issues section of a repo, there's often a list of things that others have identified at the issues, or like a list of nice to haves or something. Or if you're lucky, some projects even have like a very detailed page of, hey, listen, we're looking for specific help in these areas, and then start doing it. But I mean, depending on what you're trying to contribute, it can be a small change. Like I think my first proper open source contribution was to Chef's repo. It was literally, I think, two typos or something like that. And that was just simple, just quickly read through the docs, saw, oh, open up an issue. Did that, said what I was doing, added my pull request, linked the issue, and then, yeah, got merged.
So that's actually an interesting observation you made right there, and I want to pluck it out, which is that the first contribution you made was just typos,
Yeah.
right? And this, I think, is one of the things that can be intimidating about open source, and not even intimidating as a beginner. This is intimidating for even for me, right? I've been contributing to open source projects, not to belie my age, but for a long time, and uh, I still wander into GitHub repositories. I still wander into Codeberg projects, right? and be like, this seems interesting, but like, what do I have to say? What do I have to contribute? What do I have that I could possibly bring to what is very obviously already so perfect, and everybody that's involved is already so much smarter and so much, more competent than I am, and so on and so forth, right? And while that may be true, right? Nobody is perfect. People still make typos in their documentation, right? People will still, fail to close a bracket somewhere and a test won't pick it up. People will, comments in code get stale, right? So you'll have well commented code, and then the code changes and the comments don't keep up. And maybe you notice that,
Yep.
right? And you just be like, I don't want to change the code. The code does what it's supposed to, but the comments for the code don't line up with it anymore. And I can go in and I can just update that,
Yeah.
right? So there are no code contributions that you can be making as a first-time contributor to a project. And that is a good way to sort of get your toes wet,
Yeah. No,
right?
definitely. And I mean, especially documentation is one of those things where there's always a need for improvement or to add it or to just to help out with it. Like it's one of those things like if you want to get started, there's probably enough there to keep you busy for a lifetime, just with open source projects. So it's a really good spot to get going.
Absolutely. And if, thinking about how do we contribute, right? A lot of projects that are out there, I would say the vast majority of open source projects out there are literally just a repository sitting somewhere, right? Or literally just a collection of code. I mean, back in the day before GitHub, it was just code sitting in a directory being served by Apache or something like this, right? And you could
Yep.
just take and clone it and run with it. And that was actually one of the really cool things that GitHub enabled so many years ago now was
Mm.
this idea of it being a social activity,
Yeah.
right? It was always a social activity, but it was really, it was on arcane mailing lists and prior to that in weird forums and in BBSs and stuff
Oh
like this.
yeah.
Again, I'm belying my age somewhat, but this idea of coding being a social activity,
Yeah.
right, that we can all sort of get involved with. Larger projects that are set up a little bit better for new contributors, for people to kind of come in and get involved, are going to have structure. And there's no rules, but there are some uh, guidelines is very strong. Mm,
A bit of like culture or I'm trying to think about if you think about it, like how you interact with other humans. There's like a baseline kind of understanding. I think it'll obviously vary from place to place that you go. Um, so it depends on where you are, but I mean the general guidelines are there's a baseline, I think, that are mostly the same.
yeah, for sure. And some of these all social mores, if you will, right? These expectations about how we're going to be interacting with each other have over time coalesced and codified a little bit. And one of the places where they've coalesced, where they've codified, is because we're nerds, a file,
Yep.
right? The very venerable README is probably the first place to start, but there's actually another one which is gaining popularity, and that's contributing.
Yeah.
So all capital letters. If you're in a, if you're seeing an open source repository and you see a file and it's called contributing or contributing.txt or contributing.md, because Markdown, we all have Markdown, right? Uh, that is going to contain what you need to know in order to get started, right? You also sometimes see things like a contribute page, if there's like a wiki or something like that, and it's like how to contribute. And again, there are no rules, but if you actually go and you look in the GitHub docs, they have a whole section on how to build communities, how to how to build healthy contributions, and
Yeah.
inside of that subsection, there's this whole idea of contributor guidelines,
Yeah.
right? So if you're thinking to yourself, how do I get started with this project that is interesting to me or that I use and I feel like I have something that I could add, the first place to look is that contributing.md, right?
Yeah.
Right, for sure. Uh, so we've talked a little bit how to get started, about ways you can get started. So let's now address maybe that first question that I opened with, right? Which is, all right, you've got a project, you've got something that you're working on, a problem that you're attempting to solve, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm I feel like I want other people to get involved with this. Now, it could be for philosophical reasons. right? You could be the sort of person who just believes in open source, and that's great, right? I could also be for practical reasons. You're one person. You can't possibly understand every use case, every particular problem angle, every particular feature, right? And so getting that plurality of ideas, into play is potentially compelling to you. Another reason you might want to get involved in open source is as if you're a business, right? And you're thinking to yourself, well, we've got this problem we've attempted to solve. We've written some software to solve it, and we would like to get the software into the hands of potential users and down the line, potentially even customers, right? Oh, the journey, the road to
Yeah.
monetization, so on and so forth. We can have another
Well,
discussion about that. But why don't we kind of dive into that a little bit? Like, what would be some of the reasons why, you as an individual would put yourself out there, or you as a business would put yourself out there?
yeah. I mean, the business one I feel is got an easier answer. Because I mean, you don't have to necessarily say take your product and make it open source and give it to the world, but you should probably give people some examples. And if you do it in a GitHub repo or any other online code repository that can do collaboration and Ruby and things, that's where you can actually get feedback from the community, and they can say, oh, by the way, here's the typos like we discussed, or hey, the documentation isn't clear, or hey, here's an interesting use case. How about you give me an example of that? Which means then people can take those samples and then actually go and use your product. So I mean, obviously take AWS, for example, we've got, I think, I don't know how many thousands of repos of different examples and things that people can do. And we're not giving our source code to our internal services away, but we are showing people how to actually use our products and things. So from a business perspective, that makes a lot of sense that people want to play with. On the individual slash personal side, um, yeah, it's a you want input on whatever it is you're building or just share it. And I mean, getting started with that is as simple as creating a repo, making it open, and putting the code out there. Now, that's literally, I think, the base mechanical level of how do I do the click buttons of getting my code available to someone else to look at. But then I think it also comes back to the discussion we just had about like, okay, cool. So you've put your code out there. What do you want from putting it out there? Do you want someone to just look at it? Do you want people to help you with it? Do you want opinions? And I think that comes back to the whole thinking about the contributor guidelines and make it clear what you're looking for. It's like, even if it's just in the main README, saying like, hey, listen, I did this. Here's a quick summary of what it's supposed to do. This is what I'm interested in getting feedback on or doing it. So figure out what it is you kind of want to, why are you sharing the code? Because I mean, there has to be at least some reason.
Right, and that really speaks to the heart of it, which is what is your end goal here,
Yeah.
right? And you don't need to know what that is necessarily with perfect crystal clarity ahead of time. And it's also okay for that goal to change, right? Nothing's written in stone here. So, if your idea is, I don't know, I'll just put it on GitHub and maybe something will happen, that's fine. That is a perfectly legitimate and valid reason to want to open source your code, right? There are maybe a little bit trickier concerns, and I did mention earlier I wasn't getting into the arcana of licensing, but if you are thinking about, open source, especially if you are a business, especially if you're representing some sort of, legal entity for whatever value in your jurisdiction, right? If you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to put my source code out there are maybe some other concerns that have to kind of be taken into play there, right? And one of them is licensing. There are a couple different types of licenses out there. Is that not correct, Cobus?
Just a few, like I think two or three, a little bit more.
A little bit more, that's right. Broadly speaking, they can be classified into sort of a couple different, categories,
Mm.
right? And it, in many ways, just refers to how militant, right?
Yes.
The license is. Uh, and while at a very surface level for a given individual, any one particular license isn't going to matter that much. If you could go with GPL, you could go with, the Apache software license, you could go with the Mozilla public license, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't matter too much as an individual. For
Mm.
business, there can be repercussions,
Yeah. Although
right?
I would counter for the individual because I had an interesting one. This was, I want to say it was around 2016 or 17 or 18, around, it was before I joined AWS. I had a public repo with some examples of some Terraform implementations that I did on AWS just with my day-to-day work that I played with, that I'd learned. And I thought, this is an interesting thing to share with people. So I put it in a repo. and I shared it. And then a few months later, I actually got a ping from someone, I believe it was someone in Brazil, who said, "Hey, love this idea." Because I'd done a talk at HashiCon, or sorry, Hashi Talks Africa. Um, and they said, "Hey, listen, this looks really interesting. I would love to use this as work. Could you please add a license to it? Because I'm not allowed to touch any open source or public code unless I know what the license is in case there are down the line legal ramifications."
Well, there you go, and that is actually a pretty cogent example, right,
Yeah.
of why the license matters. It's one thing to make the code publicly available, i.e., by putting it onto a repo anybody can read, or putting it on a you could print it out and staple it to a phone pole,
You can fax it to
right?
someone.
You could tag like that's fine, but it's another for that person to then take that be able to
Yeah.
take that code and use it, right? And that's where the licensing comes into play. So, we can also, when we think about licenses, you can think about there if I recall correctly, and it's been a while since I've gotten to this arcana to be perfectly blunt, but on the one side, you have like copyleft style licenses, right? Which are very, very strongly, open source, right? And that's going to be things like, the GPL, the AGPL, GPL3 in particular, which is a thorn bush with legal issues. And then you're also going to have things like what are called permissive licenses,
Yeah.
MIT, BSD, the ASL, I think falls into that, the Apache Software License, if I recall correctly. And they do have different outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Can they be used, for commercial use, distribution, modification? Does the source need to be disclosed if you receive a compiled binary or not? Um, does the license file itself need to be included with the source code or not, or with the compiled binary or not? Can you uh, create modules or extend the software? And if so, does that need to be under the same license or not? Right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and some of this, again, if you're a business, get your lawyer, look
Yeah.
at this.
Oh,
But
yes.
there are like, you know, tools and websites out there where you could just sort of almost like a wizard, where you could just be like, this condition, this condition, this condition, this condition, and it spits out like the license that's going to be
Mm.
appropriate for you, with the caveat being that some licenses are a bit on the obscure side. So
Yeah.
that may
The
vary.
the thing here to mention as well is that GitHub is actually quite good with this. When you include the license file in the root of your repo, and it's one of the standard licenses, it actually shows you what the permissions and things are. So I'm actually just looking at some of the work I was doing this morning on some Terraform samples for using on AWS. And we use the MIT zero license, and it says there permissions are commercial use, modification, distribution, private use. That's all good. Then limitations is no liability, no warranty in terms of that, and no conditions. So it's actually a very easy way also to get an idea of what the license is.
Yeah, and that's super. And you have a lot of tools that are out there. One that I've used in a previous, you know, uh, professional situation was
Oh
Snake,
yeah, I think it's
Snake,
Snick.
Snick.
Snick. Yeah.
Even speaking with people who worked there, it was all over the place in terms of pronunciation. But they had a whole license management picker, built right in, which made sense because, of course, they were looking for, potential security vulnerabilities and whatnot. And the reality is that we don't think about it too much, but the legal ramifications of the software we're using can be a security vulnerability,
Oh yeah.
right? And so they had a really cool, like I say, interface for that. But whatever, we're not here to talk about that. Um, so okay, so we have an idea, a little bit of open source, why we might want to get involved, how we might get involved. The licenses matter, right? Um, why would we even use open source, right? So let's again, we're gonna zoom back out. We zoomed in, we're gonna zoom back out again, right? Uh, I can go to, I can still do this in the year of our Lord 2024. Go to a store and purchase software. Believe it or not, it can still be done, right? Um, Most software now, of course, is downloaded. You get a license for it, so on and so forth, right? Oh, all right, Cobus, you got to
Got a
say
save
something or don't
icon
be
for
on
you.
screen.
Oh,
Yeah, hold that
do I
back
need
up.
to? Yes, here I've got a physical save icon. I don't want to show the front because there's obviously a brand on it that I'm not allowed to show.
Save icon, I love it. Um, For you young whippersnappers that don't remember those, we used to have boxes of them, and we would carry those boxes around to other people's houses, and then we would use that.
Rem
Ooh.
Remind me to send you something afterwards. I saw someone that did a 3D print of, the old, the big 5.25 inch floppy disks, what those boxes look like. Except they printed it to scale to be able to vertically put in your SD cards, the micro SD cards.
Oh, that's super fun. I like that. A little bit of retro styling right there, right? Everybody's wandering around with home built Game Boys. Why not this,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Bring back the
Mm,
floppy disk. Exactly. Um, so so again, like why would you use open source when you could just go and you can buy a license for some software, you can get a SaaS product, everything's done through a web browser, you could just, you know, buy it from Microsoft, it doesn't matter, right?
yeah.
Why would you as a business or an individual, but I think more of a business,
Mm.
use open source?
Well, I'd say there are two main reasons that pop up immediately. The first one is cost, because usually any kind of SaaS offering or software that you buy costs you money, so there's that cost. And it might even be a recurring cost because a lot of the companies are switching more to a subscription model than a purchase and get a new version. And I think the other part of it is also, so you've got the software, there's a bug in it, or you need something else for or extensibility or something for it to do. And unless the company that you bought the software from or are using it from on a subscription implements that change or that fix or something, you don't have any option there. Where with open source, I mean, you've got the source, so you could always jump in and try and fix it yourself or implement the feature that you want or change it the way you want. So from a business perspective, that's actually a great option to have.
Yeah, for sure. So the idea that you're not locked in necessarily to a vendor, the idea that you're not locked into a particular um, purchasing agreement, a particular contractual situation, that could be a selling feature for a
Oh, yeah.
business, right? That we just go, look, like we have this software. It's a mature package. A lot of businesses around the world use it. We have a certain degree of trust in it, and we can just kind of do what we want with it.
Yeah.
And if down the line we don't want to use it anymore, that's okay, right? We can use something else. So this idea of portability, this idea of being able to chart your own path a little bit could be potentially very compelling for business. I mentioned Sneak earlier and vulnerabilities and whatnot, and that for me is another compelling reason,
Mm.
right? As a business, you're thinking to yourself, like, why would I use open source? Why would I, be a particular project that's online, or even, a company that has an open source product and you want to use their product and it happens to be open source? Like, can you trust that? Why would I trust that? And my default answer there would be I would trust it more, right? I would trust it more because the code is open, because there's many eyeballs on it, because there's more opportunities for
Mm.
people to be looking at the code, examining how it works, putting it into their test environments, putting it into their staging environments, putting it into their prod environments. And if they see something, they say something,
Oh, yeah.
right?
No,
So there are, I think, security, frankly, upsides from the world of open source.
yeah, and I mean, you can even go as far as like, because most open source projects are also distributed in some kind of binary format as well, either like, let's say, into the standard the Linux distro package managers, or you can download the compiled version. But I mean, nothing's stopping you from taking the code and compiling it yourself if you don't trust necessarily the binary even. So you can keep an eye on pretty much everything you want, dig as deep as you want.
For sure. So over the course of this conversation, I have been stealthily answering the questions that we've been receiving, although I haven't been saying them out loud, which has been the natural flow of conversation, because guess what? We're pretty good at this live stream thing. But there is actually a specific question that just came in, so thank you for this. Again, on DM. It's okay, guys. Don't worry about it. And that is, uh, I'll paraphrase it because this is a bit long, but basically says, I want to start working on an open source project to learn a new programming language. Is this a good idea? Cobus?
That one is interesting. It's definitely a good approach because looking at how different open source projects use a specific language is a very good way to do or to learn it and pick it up. Because here's a big secret: not everybody uses the language in the same way. I mean, firstly, it's like literally down to like how do people do the basic formatting of it. Some people like tabs, some people like spaces. But we're not going to discuss that. I don't want to start, derailing this too much. And I mean, and that's like on the most basic level, is like literally like how do you indent your code is a discussion, and different people have it. Now, granted, some languages are very strong on that, but some languages that's even an option. So you can go take a look at the code that they're using, how they're doing it, what is their approach to the architecture of it, how do they split their code, all of those fun and interesting things. I would say just from a basic learning it, I'd almost recommend starting somewhere else first. Because remember, at that point, you're implementing some kind of functionality. So you need to know A, the business domain of what they're trying to solve with that project, and B, their way of coding and using the language, the tooling stack, tests, all of those things. So I would say potentially starting smaller with something I might mispronounce now, Project Euler, um, which is effectively a set of algorithms or you build algorithms to solve specific problems, like generate the first 5 prime numbers and things like that. Because that's a very tangible, well understood problem case you can do. You can literally go, okay, cool, let's start with this. Now you're first going to figure out, okay, cool, I want to use language, whatever. How do I actually, because writing it, you use a text editor at the minimum, preferably some kind of IDE. But then it's, okay, cool, now that I've written this code, how do I actually make it run? Is it a compile language where I first have to compile it? Is it interpreted, like let's say Python, where I can just install Python and then just say run the code for me? Or basically figuring out like how do I actually interact with this coding language that I want to start playing around with, figure out what the basic package management tools are. So I'd say, while you can jump into a open source project directly, I'd probably start first with playing with the language on my own, just get a feel for how it works. Do a couple of small, not even full applications, just like functions, and try it out.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a Project Euler, which I actually just looked up, and I'm posting it into the Slack group now for everybody who'd like to catch it. It's actually pretty interesting. So
Mm.
it's looks like it started off as almost like an academic
Mm.
exercise, right? So I will actually just go ahead here and share that screen because we could talk about it. I think it's actually kind of interesting. So this right here is Project Euler,
All
Euler. Let's go with Euler, something like that. Anyway, it's a series of challenging mathematical computer programming problems that will require more than just mathematical insights to solve. Uh, Computer and programming skills required to solve most problems. And I think this actually is an interesting, suggestion, right? Because mathematics, pure mathematics, if it's not your bag, can feel really, really intimidating. And even if it was your bag, when you were in school 20 or 30 years ago, maybe it's not now, right? And it's true that a lot of programming languages, their getting started guides will assume that mathematics is your thing. Like if you ever looked at sort of the getting starteds for Rust or the getting starteds for Go, a lot of them dive fairly quickly into the arcana of solving mathematical problems or like the structure of the language itself. And the reason it's the way it is because of compiler internals and whatnot. And that can be rough. That's a rough way to learn a new programming language, right? So this sounds actually really interesting.
Mm.
Uh, it says here the intended audience includes students from basic curriculums not feeding their hunger to learn. That's fine. But you can see here they have a very large number of registered members, and it appears they have a whole community that you can get involved in. So that sounds really cool. Thanks for sharing that. Really, really appreciate it. So thinking about that question, is contributing to open source a good way to learn a new programming language? I think like a lot of things, the answer there is it depends, right?
Yes.
Uh, it's if you are committed to learning the new language, reading other people's code is a way to do it.
Yeah.
Um, I like reading other people's code. I am I'm that type of nerd that will read code, right? It's not everybody's thing, but I like to do it. And one of the things, if we're thinking about the tabs versus spaces debate, it's funny you brought that up, is this one hits home for me because I was a spaces person forever, always a spaces person. Didn't understand why you would use tabs when you have perfectly good spaces. And I was reading I was reading, I don't even remember what project it is now, to be perfectly honest, but I was reading somebody else's code. It was Python code to interact with TZ data, which that's brain teaser type stuff, right? And it was all tabs, which in Python, spacing matters, but it was all in tabs. And there's a whole section at the top of the file which explained the rationale for tabs versus spaces and why they went with tabs. The reason was accessibility. Spaces are always spaces, and the number of spaces, each individual character, isn't going to change. 2 spaces, 4 spaces, 8 spaces, 6 spaces. That's how it's going to be in a file the whole time. A tab, on the other hand, is a single character that the development environment can interpret as much white space as it wants.
Yeah.
So from an accessibility perspective, tabs are more easily interpreted than spaces, especially for people using screen readers, for people who have different visual setups,
Hmm.
right?
That's
Um,
interesting.
and and this was just a thing I learned from reading somebody else's open source code, right? It's not even the code itself. It was
Yeah.
just learning about accessibility, learning about what are some of the challenges faced by people who have a different visual setup.
Yeah, that's actually, I never thought about it that way. I mean, it makes complete sense because I do know with the tabs, depending on your IDE, it'll either be 2 spaces or 4 spaces, I think is the standard between those. But that is a very interesting argument.
Yeah, well, so it's not necessarily apropos of anything on this. You're talking about open source, but that I think is the sort of thing that open source unlocks, right? Like it's not maybe just about the code. It's not maybe just about solving a particular problem or business case. It's also about opening yourself up to new ideas. It's about opening yourself up to a more broad understanding of the work that's being done,
Mm.
of the people who are doing the work. And we talked about like, features and not being able to know everything. You could be an expert in, problem set number one, right? But you're not necessarily going to be an expert in problem set letter 9 and how that intersects with problem set number 1, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of some of the stuff that open source can unlock because of that broad set of contributions, because of that sort of marketplace of ideas thing that's got going on, right? And if to bring, I guess, the conversation back full circle, right? If you're talking about what would be some of the advantages, if you are a business and you're thinking to yourself, why would I go with an open source vendor, let's say, versus a closed source vendor, that could be the killer argument right there, right? Is that the closed sourced vendor mechanically cannot come up with the same feature set, with the same extensiveness, with the same attention to real world scenarios and problems that an open source vendor has access to.
Yeah. No, I mean that's it's a huge benefit because I mean it literally is like a limit. How do you want to limit the number of people that could potentially contribute to it? And I mean, I like the idea of being able to get contributions from anyone, um, versus just like the 10 people sitting in the room with me.
Right, yeah, exactly. And no shade on the 10 people sitting in the room with you,
No,
right? Like, you put 10 people in a room, they're going to come up with 10 different ideas, and that's great, right? But 10 people in a room is not the same as 10 people all over the planet doing their own thing, coming up with different ideas, right? Little comment from the community here. Tabs greater than spaces. Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Support for tabs in the community. We're gonna have to get a poll going. Tabs versus spaces, no context. Um, all right, super duper. So at AWS, since we have you on the call, Cobus, I'd like to get maybe the inside scoop to a certain degree. Um, I think it goes without saying that open source is getting used at AWS. I mean, technically, open source
yes.
is used everywhere. If you have a phone or a television or a car or anything that like uses software, you're using open source, whether you realize it or not. But AWS has, and I don't want to get into a whole flame war here, but AWS has a relationship with the open source world,
Oh yeah.
right? And Some people get mad about it, some people defend it, and that's fine. I don't want to get into that. But I mean, when we think about AWS and we think about open source, what are some of like the big projects, the big open source
Oh,
projects that AWS is involved with, either contributing or offering as a service or both?
that is probably a very long list, with obviously varying degrees of the level of involvement, because obviously we do consume and use a lot of open source internally. We actually also contribute to open source, whether it's us having a project and making it open source, or, for example, let's take an example from the last month, PyTorch. I went down to San Francisco for the PyTorch conference there to work with some team members on the content there. And I'd learned that we actually have dedicated engineers inside AWS that focus just on contributing to that open source project. The specific example, or the person that I spoke with, is working and leading the efforts on PyTorch's ARM64 optimizations. So, I mean, that's literally AWS paying the headcount for the person to actually spend all their time to help and improve the project in that regard. It's also the other contribution we have there is they recently donated, well, I don't know if donated is the right word, but basically gave AWS credits for PyTorch to move the entire build system to run on AWS, so they don't have to pay the cost anymore of building all the different versions of it. So there's varying degrees on that. I mean, then we've got folks that are on some of the foundation's boards and active, like, in spare time contribution. Obviously, when we put out samples out there, we put that out as open source, etc. So it's quite a long list there of how we contribute.
For sure. And that's a good thing, I think, to point out, right? Is it's one thing to consume open source, and we've talked about the myriad benefits of that, and that's fine. But contributing back, like, why would you do that? You would contribute back possibly, again, philosophically, because you believe in the importance and the power of open source. You could be contributing back because you legitimately have a feature, you've solved a problem, you've made the thing better, and you want that to be included upstream so that you don't have to maintain your own weird split of the software, right? As an individual, you might want to contribute back because you want to gain some notoriety, right? If you have a bunch of contribs to a major CNCF project on your resume, that makes your resume look better,
Yep.
right? An organization like AWS is going to be contributing to the greater ecosystem. I would say probably for every possible reason that there is. You know what I mean? We mentioned earlier it's a tentacular organization. So every reason to contribute back, you're going to be able to find it there. From our side at Cerbos, obviously we're not AWS. We're a scrappy startup with an open source product, and also a paid product. If somebody would like to look into that, happy to talk about that. But our core product is open source, and we have so many users of it. So thank you if you're out there a user. Um, and our big thing there is we contribute not only the actual policy decision point, the thing out to the open source communities. We want people to use it because we think it solves a problem, a real problem, and uh, we also are contributing not necessarily to code, but we're contributing to the ecosystem in the space that we're in. And we talk about what is the contributions that you can make, and sometimes they're no code, right? And they could be documentation, but they could also be things like standards groups, working groups, the sorts of bodies that are establishing the guidelines and the rules of engagement, if you will, for how computers are supposed to speak to each other, how we as humans are supposed to be thinking about structuring data, and so forth. And not every working group is in the open, but the vast majority of working groups on the internet today are actually open standards bodies, right? One of the big ones you may have heard of is like the IETF, for example, right? And there are other sort of working groups, especially around web standards and whatnot. And one of the working groups that we're, a part of is the Offsen working group, thinking about how do we standardize this, how do we talk about authorization, how do we build authorization, and make that happen. Is AWS involved in any of those sorts of standards and working groups?
I would have to go check on that. I don't know offhand. But the thing that you touched on now is like amusing because I have to put my hand up for who's ever rolled their own authentication or authorization system and realized you should never do it and stick with standards. Even it's a if you've dealt with any kind of like custom authorization system before where it's not a standard, you'll know how much fun that is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's the best part about a closed standard is how undocumented it is. So that'll be super, super fun. We got more questions coming in.
Oh,
Cobus, you have
nice.
a little bit more time? Is
Yeah,
that
yeah, no, I
okay?
can go for a little bit.
I can go for a little bit longer
I
too.
I can give
So
you a fun little anecdote on this, custom implementation. Years ago, I worked at a company that did systems for credit card and banking systems, and they have or they use HSMs, hardware security modules, I think they're called. Basically, things that manage the encryption of the data. And they had just rolled out a brand new encryption scheme. It wasn't a public one; it was a completely proprietary one. And I spent the longest call I've ever in my life on a conference call with folks trying to debug this, 13 hours to realize at the end, because we were still in development mode, there was an actual algorithm mistake. So it couldn't actually generate the keys correctly. And that's why it was failing. It wasn't actually anything to do with the code we were building and the integration we did. It was ultimately was still a bug in the actual algorithm, but nobody knew. That's the conclusion we came to. We found out afterwards when they went and audited the code or just looked at it and yes, that was the cause, but we couldn't solve it because we couldn't look at what that algorithm was for the code.
well, that's it. No, it's a black box. It's a black
Yeah.
box, right? Your data goes in and data comes out, and hopefully it's data you expect. And when it's not, what are you going to do, right?
Oh yeah.
So thank you for that anecdote. We got a couple questions here from the community, so I will address them. First question here, the first one, how to not get burned out as a maintainer? I was a maintainer and maker of a popular awesome list, getting a lot of weekly PRs, and it started to feel overwhelming. I have some thoughts on this, but Cobus, as someone who's been involved in the open source world
Mm.
and has probably felt
Oh yeah.
the overwhelming, I mean, how to handle that.
I think it's all about managing and setting expectations and also boundaries and being very clear. Coming back to that whole contribution file, like being very clear about what it is you would like for people to contribute. Because um, if, for example, let's say this awesome list now, I can imagine people getting excited about that and saying, "Oh, here's a lot more interesting links that I want you to add to this awesome list," or whatever it is that's being put inside the list. But if you, for example, in your contribution guidelines, they say, "Hey, listen, I'm going to be looking at mergers, let's say once a week, at this day, even if you want to be that specific." And we're going to aim to get through X number of submissions. Because remember, at the end of the day, it's still, I have to sit down, look at what's being sent that people want to add, validate it, and go and check, does this actually fit with my idea of what I want in this list? And that does take a lot of energy. So I think setting those expectations up front and doing it, and then just being very, I would say, firm with them and applying them and say, like, listen, if somebody bugs you on the PR saying, hey, listen, go look at the contribution guidelines. This is when I'll be able to look at it. This is how we're going to handle it. Because then people know what to expect. And then it's much easier to have the harder conversations with someone that doesn't want to adhere to whatever you described the process is that you want to follow here and say, listen, I want to get this in now. You can go, hey, this is the process. Please wait your turn. Um, and that's it. I mean, it's all about setting boundaries and figuring out what you can do. And also then I think the important part is part of that is things change. Just because right now I can spend 5 hours a week coding every evening on my open source project, that's going to stay the same. And when those things change, just be open about them and communicate them in a way that people can see them and then you can point them at that. And most people are understanding. I mean, they'll understand, hey, listen, for example, me, I used to do like, I think the best example was my idea of fun was Friday night, I think working till 1 a.m., 2 a.m. on my own chef infrastructure at home to manage my 3 little servers that I had there. That was my idea of like a brilliant Friday night and playing with things and learning. Where nowadays I've got 2 kids. Guess what? That's probably not what I want to do on a Friday night. Um, so yeah, be open, communicate.
Yeah, just setting boundaries. That's the most critical thing, right? And in that, that contributing.md file we spoke about earlier, you are your own contributor, right? It's not everyone else against you. You were part of that community. And that contributing file should not only include like, well, how do we structure a pull request or, whatever, but also like, what are the expectations, right? Like, hey, I review PRs once a month. So I'm just letting you know that's the expectation, right? And that could be a big way of helping that for sure. Another way too there is getting other people involved. It's open source. right? If you're feeling overwhelmed, see if there are other people in your community that are themselves regular contributors that seem to have a good sense of what it is that you're looking for, and reaching out to them and going, "Hey, uh, there's too much activity for me to handle. Would you like to get involved with this? Right? Is this something that we can be maybe doing together? Right? That's another, way to do that as well. And I would say it is okay to also take a break,
Yeah.
right? That's another thing. No one's gonna like rag on you for taking a vacation. You know what I mean? Just be like, hey, I'd like to thank the amazing community. We've had such a great time so far. Keep the PRs coming, but I just want to let everybody know that like I'm gonna be gone. I need to take a
Yeah.
little break for a month. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves. Feel free to keep, proposing things and reviewing things. And then when we come back, stronger than ever, healthy and refreshed, we'll be good to go. One more question, I think, before we wrap it up, if that's okay with you, Cobus, from the community. Question, and I just so it's a valid question, relates to something we spoke about earlier. How do you present or organize, I guess, the presentation of your open source contributions on a resume, on a CV? I mentioned that it's a good way to
Yeah.
pad it out, but how do you do that? Cobus, you've listed these on
Yes.
your CV in years past. How did you do it?
Yes. Um, what I would do there, depending on the number of contributions that you have, is to think about what are you trying to tell your potential new employer with that story? So is it a case of, hey, look, I know about open source, or hey, look, I've done things in the area that this job offers for, etc., to figure out how to do it. A nice way as well, especially if you've done a lot, is that you wouldn't be able to fit that into the one part of your CV that you want to dedicate to this necessarily is I know GitHub and most of the other Git providers that you can use to host your code has got some way to actually visualize that. I mean, it can literally be as simple as create a repository and call it my contributions or about me or whatever you want to call it. In there, you've got one README file that has all of these details. So it's an easy way for people then to be able to find that thing. But I think it all boils down to like what it is you're trying to show. And also, I know my personal GitHub repository at the moment, I've got a bunch of different things that I haven't touched in years. Don't be ashamed of that. It happens. It just shows that you had various interests of things happening. I mean, I literally last week, and this, Dan, will be a blast to the past for you, is I had a pull request for a Datadog repository closed, which I had opened in 2014. I was adding a bit of a chef module or something in there, and it only got closed last week because I didn't end up finishing it. So it is a case of seeing it on a CV is a great thing. I mean, it at least shows me, hey, um, Git, because you've got some stuff on there at least. You've got an idea of open source sharing. It's a good starting point for a conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking about GitHub and this idea of it being a social sort of a thing, don't be afraid to set your profile up, right? It's meant to be shown off. And so, like, if you go to github.com/my horrible username, you can see here, I've got a little picture of me, I've got a little README, and you can put whatever you want in here, right? I just mentioned kind of some places where I've worked and that I'm into time zones and wine because I'm very boring. And you can also pin, if there are particular repositories that you want to show off,
Mm.
you can pin them here. And a lot of the stuff that that I work with is not necessarily going to be interesting to a broad audience. And so I put some stuff here that I thought people uh, would find helpful. And one of them is this GitHub gist that I put in as a way to remind myself of something like 6 or 8 years ago. And it's literally just a little bit of Python code where you send it an HTTP request and it just echoes the headers back to you. Because I was trying to extract headers from undocumented software to see how it was behaving when it would hit the web server. And it turned into this living document. And people have been slowly contributing to it for years. I've now got a Python 3 version of it. There's, command line switches you can send to it, and so on and so forth, right? And this is just like a really straightforward way to be like, hey, this is some stuff I've worked on. These some areas that I find interesting. And you can include your social links in here. And you also have this little thing about your contributions and what you've worked on. And this to me is kind of like this is the fastest way to share that, with an audience. So on your CV, on your resume, right, just put, hey, check out my GitHub profile, right? And if you don't have a GitHub page, that is okay. You probably have, something on like a Codeberg maybe, or the Atlassian one, I can't remember the name of, or this GitLab, right? And maybe you don't have any of those things. And guess what? It's still okay because you can, for example, set up like a link tree, or you can set up,
Mm,
whatever you like, right? So, but just sort of collect, the projects and the things that you want to show off and talk about and highlight, put them somewhere, and then just put a link to that or like a QR code, right, in this day and age, onto your CV. I think that's probably going to be the most straightforward way to do it. All right. So we are actually, I was going to say we're at time. We're actually a little over time. We'd scheduled this for 45 minutes, but we've crept up to an hour. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. And also respectful to you, Cobus, for taking the time out today to hang out, to share a little bit your thoughts, observations, talk a little bit about AWS, its relation to open source, and also a little bit about your relationship to open source. Do you have anything coming up that you would like our community to know about?
Um, yes, I am actually busy working on some fun content at the moment. I literally just pushed an update before we started this call this morning about using Terraform to bootstrap your AWS account. Effectively, I'm just selfishly, because I work for AWS, so I want people to use AWS. But what I'm looking at is what's the shortest amount or the least amount of code I can use to actually get a full CI/CD pipeline going with Terraform. So it does like the planning on your PR. So I've published that code. I'll send you the link afterwards, but short version is there's a GitHub organization called build-on-AWS. And the repos in there, Terraform samples, you can have a look there about things that, and I'll be adding more to it there in the near future.
Excellent. Super duper. All right. So thank you to our lovely community for sending along your questions beforehand and also during the live stream. That was really fun to get those during the live stream. Or keeps us interested and engaged. So I really like that. And just a reminder to let everyone know we are doing another live stream next week. It will be on roughly the same time zone situation because I'll still be here in Phoenix for one more week before I head back to the UTC positive side of the world. And that's going to be on stateless and it's going to be on microservices. We're probably going to throw some serverless in there. And we'll see. I got another special guest lined up for that. I'm going to be happy to reveal that person's name a little bit later. So thank you again to Cobus. Thank you to you, our audience. And we will see you on the internets. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
All right, stream is ended.